Hi guys and gals and kittens, and welcome to the I Need a Magic Show. So in this video I'm going to give you a walkthrough of HyperIDE. Now if you have a Cloudlet and you're logged into it, you can of course watch this video if you just want to have a chatbot. However, in this video I'm going to go through create/HyperIDE. What is HyperIDE? Well, IDE is an acronym. We developers love this acronym. It means Integrated Development Environment. It's typically one of those tools your neighboring software developer is using when he is creating software. However, one of the unique traits about HyperIDE is that it significantly lowers the bar in regards to creating software. And I'm going to be showing you that by going into Manage, choosing Plugins, and install one of our plugins. Now, if I, for instance, install, let's say, the registration module here now, then I go back to HyperIDE and I choose the modules folder here. You will see I have a registration folder. Registration folder has a folder called workflows, which contains workflows and actions. Now, if I filter on, for instance, users, and I choose the toolbox here now, you will see I have 4 actions that are related to users. I cannot use these actions now because I don't have an open file. However, if I now de-expand this guy, I select the modules folder and I create a new folder and I call my folder foo, just to have a name. And I choose that folder and I create a new file called bar.hl. Then I have a hyper lambda file, at which point all of a sudden, all of these toolbox items became enabled. Now I am creating code, but I'm going to be creating code without coding, which is kind of like the big point. First of all, I can provide a description to my code. Allows a user to register in the backend. That is what my Hyperlambda workflow does. Then I can choose arguments to my workflow, at which point I will choose name, type string, email, type string, username, type string, and password, type string. Okay. Now if I save this file, I now already have a Hyperlambda file that takes 4 arguments, name, email, username, and password, at which point I can start using these arguments in my own workflow, which basically is a backend code that allows me to perform some sort of like state changes towards my server. Now I want to filter on user name here, at which point I will see my toolbox is being filtered according to what I'm searching for in the top left corner here. Now what I want to do now, I want to first verify that the user name that the user specified to this particular workflow is available. So I click username available, at which point it automatically populates the username. Why? Because it's got the same name as the name of the field that this particular action actually takes. Then I want to ensure that it throws. Throws basically means it will raise an error if the username already exists. If I now click OK, now my username, as you can see in the top right corner here, is team. So if I now invoke this Hyperlambda file, first saving it, Alt-S or Option-S on the Mac, by clicking F5 now, then a model dialog will ask me for parameters to my workflow, at which point I can write Thomas@gaiasol.com, and now comes the point. If I write team and just like some random password, it's going to throw an exception and I'm going to get an error back from the backend. Why? Because this particular action that I chose here, username available, will actually throw an error and aborting the rest of the execution of my Hyperlambda file if that username is already registered. If I try to execute it again, I write Thomas@gaiasol.com, and I write blah, 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 something random, in addition to just a random password. It does not throw. So now I have an if statement, basically might say indirectly through the execution of the username available action that actually verifies that the username is available. Now I can safely create the users, and I click the users create, at which point you see username and password is automatically populated. If they're not, you will actually get a suggestion for input arguments, or you can statically write any like static value you wish. However, I obviously want to use the input argument to my workflow named password. And then I want to do OK here now. If I save this file and I click F5 now, and I write Thomas and Thomas at gaiasol.com, and I write username Thomas and just some random gibberish password, right? Now when the workflow is done, executed, then if I now go back and I open up manage and users and roles in a different tab, you will see I now have a Thomas user. However, let me delete that guy to avoid polluting my backend. Let me delete this foo guy too. It's from a previous YouTube video. So now what I want to do, let's say I want to use the name and the email input arguments. It's very important that when you create a workflow, as a general rule of thumb, you should be at the bottom of your file. Command arrow down or end on a Windows machine. Basically just scroll to the bottom and you provide you click at the bottom of your window to ensure that the blinking caret is at the bottom. You don't have to do that. You can do like this. Now if I mark this code, I delete it and I click now username available, then I can insert code at this particular place in my hyperlambda file. But if I try to, let's say I do this is an error, right? If I now try to click here now, system's going to tell me that my caret's position is not valid. Why? Because it's not a modulo of 3. Hyperlambda has 1, 2, 3 spaces. 1, 2, 3 spaces to denote scope. For the record, if you're ever stuck with something, you can either click here, help, or you can click the AI chatbot. Now, for instance, if I ask it, how do I'm not going to do it because it takes time to invoke OpenAI, but it's actually going to answer my questions related to workflows, Hyperlambda, or Magic Cloud in general. So now I have created a user with a username and a password. What I want to do now, I want to associate, I'm going to be using the extra text box at the top here. I want to associate extra fields with that particular user. You see here, it's an action called extras -upsert. This allows me to associate multiple extra fields with a specific username. The user is already at this point registered, so I can now provide name and email. And now if I save this file and I save the file and I execute it and I pass in Thomas and Thomas at gaiasol.com, username foo, password blah blah, and I click carriage return. And now if I refresh this window here now containing my users, you will see that now the foo user is associated with the name Thomas and the wrong email apparently. Why did that happen? What did I provide as input? Let me try again. Yes, as you can see, I did a mistake here on this last action. So let me just delete it and upsert it again. So now let me do name, email, and now I want to do email, of course. Okay, yes. And now let's save it. F5 to execute the hyperlambda file. Thomas at gaiasol.com. Foo. Let's try again and see what it produces. And now you can see that it's still doing it. Yes, because the user was already taken. So let me delete this guy. Demo trolls. No YouTube video is complete without a couple of demo trolls. Let me execute it again. Thomas at gaiasol.com. Foo. Hopefully with a little bit of luck now. Let's see here now. As you can see, it passes in username, it passes in name and email correctly. So now my email should be Thomas at gaiasol.com here, so you can see. So I now have a user with a name and an email, etc. Let's say I want to change the input arguments such that in addition, I want to have Stripe payments. I want this particular user to be like deducting, I don't know, $50 from his like whatever account or something. Okay, in order to do that, I need another plugin. I go to manage, I go to plugins and realize that most of these plugins actually has additional actions that are related to whatever domain that particular plugin happens to be solving. Here you see the Stripe payments plugin. If I install this now, I have additional actions that allows me to interact with Stripe. Then I go back to Hyper IDE, expand modules, expand foo, expands my bar HL file. I go at the bottom here. If I now filter on Stripe, you will see that I now have a bunch of additional actions. Right. Now, before I do that, let me hold down the Alt key or Option on the Mac and click Q. Why? And by the way, all of these keyboard shortcuts, you will find them in the short keys here. So now if I basically hold down Option and click Q, then I'm allowed to change the arguments collection to my endpoint. I want to have now card no type string exp year type string, or I don't know, it's probably an int. I presume it doesn't really matter. Exp month int CVS string. Okay. Oh, and then let's do amount. Amount is decimal. Now I can't remember if I actually configured Stripe such that it actually has my API tokens. However, let's see if it works by filtering on Striper and then choosing customer create. Now I want to create a customer whose name is the name specified to the endpoint and email is the email specified to the endpoint. And then let's add some metadata, username. So I've now created a connection between my Stripe customer and my user internally within my Magic backend. Let's save this guy and click F5. If I have configured Stripe now, this should work. If not, it should not work. I can't entirely remember. Let's choose a new username, card no. And if I have configured it, it's definitely the test Stripe account, which has a 42 credit card, 2026, month 8, amount, CVS 314, and amount, let's do 67. See if this works now. And my password was not valid, so let's try again. It needs to be more than 12 characters. Thomas@gaiasol.com, username, howdy, password, at least 12 characters, 8, 314, 67 amounts. Let's see if this works. If I actually configured Stripe, if it doesn't, it's besides the point. The way to configure Stripe is to go into and it actually works, is to go into MISC and configuration. I can't show it to you because there are secrets in that particular file, such as my Stripe API token, etc. However, the point being that I now actually have created a Stripe customer. Now I can associate a payment method with that customer. Now the customer ID is returned from the previous action. This is a general pattern. You see, if I now execute this one, you see a workflow consists of an action. And let me just execute it to show you the point. You see, every single action optionally might return something. Here you see username available. It takes one input argument, being the username, and it returns a Boolean value, being true or false. Or for this particular case, this one will actually throw. Then the next action will actually have this output argument from the previous action available to use as its input. This allows you to chain actions together. So now you will see in my users create action here, it actually takes a username and a password, and that one doesn't return anything, it just simply throws if it fails. Then it does extra upsert. That one also only takes input, it doesn't produce output, but you will see my Stripe customer create action here. It's actually returning customer ID. So now if I go at the bottom of my workflow and I click the Stripe payment method create, you will now see that it's automatically being populated by the returned value from my previous action, because it just so happens to be ending with customer ID, and the name of this parameter as an input to this particular action is customer_ID. If I remove it, you will see that it also suggests it here at the bottom for me, allowing me to click it. Then card number, expiration year, expiration month, CVS. Okay, so now I've associated the payment method with this particular customer in Stripe. Then I can create the payment create. Okay, now USD, description, payment form magic. Return URL, don't really need, but we do need a customer ID. Yet again, this originates from the create customer action. Need a payment method ID. This was returned from the previous action where we created the payment method. The amount is the input to the endpoint. And well, we can still do username, I guess, to associate the payment to with a specific user. Okay. Now save. F5. Thomas. Foo3. And ta-da, I've now registered the user in my backend, associated it with the extra fields, name and email, and I've made a purchase for that particular client using his particular actual credit card. Now, what I need to do now is that if you look at the name of my file, let me just de-expand the toolbox. You see the name of the file is bar.hl. Now, there's actually no way for me to actually invoke this hyperlambda file besides from internally from within my backend. However, if I rename it and I add get.hl at the end, bar, that's the name of the URL of the endpoint. Get is the name, actually let me use post. Post is the HTTP verb for the endpoint, and HL of course means hyperlambda. And then I click caret return. I now have an HTTP post endpoint that I can actually invoke. Now, if I go to the bottom here, I filter on return dash and I expand my toolbox, then I can return the result of the last action, Option S or Alt S on Windows. I can go to manage, I can go to endpoints in a different window, and I can find, what was the name? Foo bar, and I can actually invoke this endpoint. So I now have an HTTP endpoint that I can actually invoke. And let me illustrate that by simply copying. Actually, let me go back to HyperID, and instead of doing it that way, let me just choose this folder, my foo modules here, such that that one is the selected thing. Let me click HTTP. Now I can copy the URL of it. Then I can go to ChatGPT and I can create a new GPT that allows me to actually register and perform a purchase, providing my credit card number. Hopefully, if OpenAI allows me to do that. Let me see, import from URL, import, use my, what was the name? Foo bar action. To create a user and accept a payment. If I give you incomplete data, ask me for all fields required to invoke the endpoint. Okay, howdy is the name of it. And then conversation starter. I want to register and purchase. Now, if I save this guy only for me, confirm, and I click this guy, point being that hopefully the GPT is actually going to ask me for the required info. Great, to register and process your purchase, I'll need some information for you. Could you please provide the following details, okay? Full name. Thomas Hansen, email address thomas@ainiro.io, username, username is Thomas Hansen, password is card number is 42. Expiration year is 2026. Expiration month is 8. CVS is 314 and amount is 77. See, hopefully this is going to be working now, at which point we're actually going to be, from our GPT, create the user, accept the credit card, and actually perform a purchase through Stripe. I need to emphasize, I don't want to, there are other means to actually accept purchases by adding a purchase link. Why is that important? Well, because you don't really want to provide your credit card information through OpenAI, right? So obviously this is bogus credit card, so it doesn't really matter for this particular use case. However, the point being is that I now created a registration API accepting payments, and I did it with zero coding. If I now go to my users here and I refresh, you will see that there is a new user here called Thomas_Hansen. If I logged into my Stripe account, you would see there was a payment of $77 originating from the credit card having the number of 42. And that's pretty kick-ass, I think. Now, this is basically the ability you have in HyperIDE to basically create code without coding. And I need to emphasize, I actually didn't write a single line of code. I did everything 100% using low-code and no-code software development constructs. Still, the system produced 110 lines of code for me that I immediately could access through an API and connect to my own GPT. Now, if you're stuck with anything related to HyperLambda, you can click the AI chatbot here, and you can ask it, for instance, how do I create a JWT token? Let's say we wanted an endpoint that allowed the user to authenticate with his previously registered username and password. Okay, how do I create a JWT token? This is going to provide me with the required HyperLambda that I will need to use in order to generate a JWT token that I can return back to the client. And then, of course, we have huge amounts of documentation here. You can click the question mark, you can click read more. There's like 250 pages if you print them into a PDF here in total, explaining every single possible thing, almost, or at least 95% of it, that you might need as you're actually using Magic Cloud and HyperLambda. Here you can see auth ticket, create username, blah, blah, etc. So anyways, that was it for today's YouTube video. A little bit of a walkthrough through HyperIDE and specifically its low code and no code software development constructions through workflows and actions. Now, if you click function control space on a Windows, you will get autocomplete on the Mac. Sorry, if you click control space on Windows, you will get autocomplete on Windows. So this is how Magic basically allows you to create software without having to manually write the code. Now, have a look at all of these things you will find down here in your toolbox, and also play around with the plugins and see what plugins are available and how you can utilize them, etc. So anyways, that was it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.